Peace be with you. Friends, I love the opportunity today to talk about the church's social teaching, and the prompt comes from readings 1 and 2 because they beautifully show, if you want, both sides of the church's social teaching, the beautiful balance that we can find in this regard. Let me start with someone I've mentioned a lot to you before because I do think, even more than Karl Marx, he's the most influential philosopher of the 19th century. I'm talking about Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who said that we're kind of beyond good and evil, there are no objective moral values. So what's left, he thought, was the Übermensch, he called him, the Superman, who with his great will to power asserts his prerogatives and his authority. So Nietzsche was obsessed with the idea of power. Who exercises power? The right of the strong man to kind of assert himself. Well, Nietzsche's influence is everywhere in the 20th century. You see it in someone like Heidegger. You see it clearly in C.G. Jung. You see it in the novels of Ayn Rand, for example. You see it in Jean-Paul Sartre. But I think most clearly you see it in the reflections of Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher that worked in the 70s and 80s. And I think Foucault is the most influential philosopher when it comes to today's wokeism. A lot of the attitudes we see today come up out of this Foucault and then ultimately Nietzsche tradition. Now, what am I talking about? Well, looking at social, political, economic, and cultural institutions primarily from the standpoint of power and the abuse of power. So the tendency to look behind the social, political, cultural institutions and see actually plays of power, to see oppressive people, powerful people, oppressing the weak and the poor. It's a kind of deconstruction of social institutions, a hyper stress on power, so that our confidence in political, social, economic institutions is sort of shaken. Now go back, as I record these words, it's a couple years ago, to the summer of 2020, that really terrible summer in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and there was so much unrest in our country. And you heard from a lot of people, I would say, this sort of Nietzsche-Foucault rhetoric. Political, cultural, economic institutions are just corrupt, and we've got to tear them down. I mean, think of a slogan like defund the police, not just reform the police or, get some bad apples out, but defund the whole operation. Knock down the physical structures that embody political and cultural institutions. Well, that instinct, born of Nietzsche coming up through Foucault, can I suggest to you, everybody, is repugnant to Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching does not demonize power, whether that's economic or cultural or political power. Now, the main reason is very simple. God is described as being powerful, in fact, all-powerful. One of the most fundamental things we say about God in the Creed is that he's almighty. So if God is powerful, we can't say power in itself is a bad thing. No, in fact, our tradition says that political power is a kind of participation in the power of God. It's a sort of delegated authority from the supreme authority of God. Look, if power is the capacity to affect change, there might be a way just to define it. Therefore, political power is the capacity to affect change in the political and social order. Well, it's not a bad thing in itself. In fact, it's required for the proper functioning and orderliness of the political reality. Think here of St. Augustine's famous definition of peace as the tranquillitas ordinis. Not just tranquility, but tranquillitas ordinis. That means the tranquility of order, the tranquility that comes from a properly ordered society. Well, where does that come from? But from the proper exercise of political, economic, and social power. So we don't demonize. Now, why am I talking about all of this? Well, my prompt is coming from our second reading from Paul's first letter to Timothy, a letter that's interesting in so many ways. But here's the line I'm focusing on. Paul says, I ask that supplications, prayers, petitions, and thanksgivings be offered for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may lead a quiet and tranquil life. Well, Paul isn't demonizing political authority. Now, in his time, he wouldn't have dreamed of the kind of representative democracy that we have. He's accustomed to kings and emperors and so on. But he's not demonizing them. He's saying, no, they're required for a tranquil and quiet life, and therefore we ought to pray that the divine power, the divine authority might inform the work that they do. This is reflected, of course, now up and down the centuries. And you find it in the church's social teaching, which sees the supreme value of political order. Think, too, of the fact, everybody, that we've canonized several political figures, maybe most famously Louis IX, Saint Louis, right? St. Louis, the saintly king of France, but Elizabeth of Hungary and Stanislaus of Poland, I mean, many others. So the church doesn't demonize power, even that kind of supreme power that kings have. More to it, it's in the liturgical books themselves. At every Mass, every Sunday Mass, when we pray the prayers of the faithful, well, we're obligated. We're obligated by the church's liturgy to pray for the Pope first, yes, but then for civil leaders. So we're following exactly this recommendation in 1 Timothy. You know, one more observation here, and I think it's not commented upon very much, at least I don't find it. But the most famous line in 1 Timothy has got to be that this is good and pleasing to God our Savior, who wills everyone to be saved. And, you know, that's the source of much debate and controversy. But it's part of this recommendation to pray for political leaders. Again, so pray, petitions, thanksgiving, etc. This is good and pleasing to God our Savior, who wills everyone to be saved. Somehow, even our salvation follows from the right exercise of authority. And that, to me, isn't very puzzling. If salvation's a function of our right moral behavior is to some degree predicated upon the orderliness of our society. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, power, political power, is a necessary prerequisite for salvation. This is the very high view the church has of political power and authority. Okay, that's one side of it, if you want. And I'm not going to gainsay any of that. All of that remains true. But then we look at the other side. And this is the richness of Catholic social teaching. And my prompt here is our first reading from the book of the prophet Amos. Amos, a bit like Isaiah here, one of the great prophets, if you want, of social justice, we'd say today. Amos, who was quoted again and again by Martin Luther King. One of the most poetic and powerful critics of the abuse of power. So, without going as far as Nietzsche and Foucault and simply kind of demonizing political power, is the church, with its roots in these ancient Hebrew prophets, very aware of the dangers of an abuse of political power? Yes. And see, everybody, I think it makes the Bible very distinctive. You look in the literature of the ancient world, whether this is, it's Babylon, it's Assyria, it's Persia, it's Rome itself, what do you find? Almost across the board, you find a tendency to apotheosize political authority. What I mean by that fancy term is to turn kings and emperors into gods. We worship them. They're flawless and infallible. There are no limits to their power. Look at the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. It happens through Julius Caesar, then into his adopted son. After Caesar's death, in fact, he's called divus, he's called divine. And then his son takes this title, since he's the son of Caesar, he's the Huios tou theou, he's the son of the god. Yes, most ancient cultures divinize their political leaders. Then there's the Bible. Oh, read these wonderful accounts. You'll find it in the Samuel literature when Israel is asking for a king so they can be like other nations. And the prophet Samuel tells them exactly what kings in their corruption are going to do. But now, listen to Amos from our reading today. Extraordinary rhetoric. You see why King liked him so much. Hear this, You who trample upon the needy and destroy the poor of the land. When will the new moon be over, you ask, that we may sell our grain, and the Sabbath that we may display our wheat? Now, what's he talking about there? People who, during times of religious festivals, that's the new moon, the Sabbath, and so on, they wouldn't do their economic work. They wouldn't do their exploitative work. They can't wait for these religious festivals to be over so they can get back to exploiting the poor. Hear this, you who trample upon the needy and destroy the poor of the land. This is not somebody who's acquiescing to the whims of political authority. This is not somebody who's divinizing emperors and kings. Au contraire. He goes on. This is now in the language of the corrupt figures. We will diminish the ephah, add to the shekel, and fix our scales for cheating. What's going on here with people that know how to work and kind of game the system? Think of it as a sign of economic corruption. We talk about people that play the Wall Street game in a corrupt way. Well, this is their ancient ancestors here. We will buy the lowly for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. Wow, there's nothing like this, everybody, in the literature of the ancient world. On the contrary. But here's a prophet willing to stand up, as we say today, speaking truth to power. But naming this deep corruption. We will buy the lowly for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. What stands at the center of your economic concern? Here's a question now for all of us. We're all involved in our own economic system. What's at the center of it? Care for the poor? Concern for those who don't have enough? Drawing more and more people into the dynamics of the market so they can benefit from it? Or do we, out of self-concern and self-preoccupation, send more to the margins, send more into the ranks of the poor? Let the prophet Amos's words get deep down into your mind and deep down into your heart and bug you. How are we exercising political and economic authority? We don't demonize it. No. We pray for our leaders. We recognize the importance of our leaders, yes, even for our salvation. We require the tranquillitas ordinis that comes from properly constituted political and economic authority. At the same time, with these great prophets, we are deeply aware of the ways that power can be corrupted. Okay, there's Catholic social teaching in this wonderful both-and quality. But the question that should stay in our hearts and minds is, how do we relate to power in our society? How do we, the visible, if it does attain this level of real aesthetic quality, it draws you through it toward the invisible source of all beauty, toward the pure form, if you want, who is God.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. There's been a shocking uptick in the number of people around the world destroying famous pieces of art, which has raised a lot of questions about the value and the purpose of art. So that's what we're going to discuss today with His Excellency Bishop Robert Barron, Bishop of the Diocese of Winona-Rochester. Bishop, good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to be with you, too.
Wanted to update people on a couple things in your life. One is you just had this big press conference announcing something exciting in your diocese. I thought you could share it with all of our listeners here.
Yeah, we're moving our pastoral center from Winona to Rochester. So about 4 years ago, our diocese became the Diocese of Winona-Rochester, and a parish in that city was named the Co-Cathedral. So we kind of anticipated this move a few years ago. It's been thought about for a long time. So when I arrived here, I knew it was kind of in the works. But through the generosity of a particular donor, we have the land and the funds, and we really do need it. And for a variety of reasons, it's a good idea to move from Winona to Rochester. So I announced it, and we have a Minnesota winter intervening, but we'll probably start the serious building process in the spring, and then about a year from that point, it should be finished. So hoping about a year and a half from now, we'll have our new pastoral center, which is much needed in wonderful Rochester.
You shared some of the architectural renderings, and I think the feature that got the most attention was the chapel there had this beautiful rose window, which I know is central to your spirituality.
Yeah, and I really wanted the building to be not just a bland office building, but to have something of the Catholic spirit, because it'll be right there in the, not quite downtown Rochester, but near the heart of things. And I wanted it to be evangelical, that people going by would say, hey, what's that building? And it's got a Catholic ethos and spirit. So looking forward to that.
Well, second exciting development is that just a few days before this episode airs, it marks the launch of your newest book, and it's titled The Great Story of Israel, Election, Freedom, Holiness. This book offers a theological and spiritual commentary on the first half of the Old Testament. And I know, Bishop, this was your big COVID project. Of all the evil and suffering that came out of that terrible pandemic, this was one of the goods that came out of it. So tell us about this book and why people should pick it up.
There are two, really. One was the Creed book, Light from Light. I wrote that at the beginning of COVID. And then as part of our overall Bible project, I think everyone of our listeners knows, we're bringing out that gorgeous Word on Fire Bible. And it features commentary from me. So I had done, a fair amount of commentary over the years about the New Testament, but for the Old Testament, we needed more commentary. So I started doing some of that, and it grew into this more extended, really book-length commentary. So this really is volume 1 of 2. I've just now commenced writing volume 2, which will be on the prophets and the so-called wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So I hope, please God, at the end of this project, we'll have about a 600-page commentary on the whole Old Testament. Now, because of COVID, I did have more time to work on this first volume. So we'll see how it goes. Now that I'm, ordinary in this diocese and we don't have a pandemic going on, it might be a little slower going.
All right, well, let's shift to the topic of today, which is art. I couldn't believe some of these stories, and more importantly, the photos of some of these scandals. I wish we could share them online. Maybe people can Google them, but there's been a shocking uptick in the number of people destroying art for political reasons. Let me give you a few examples. So there were 2 environmental activists who threw a can of tomato soup over one of the most famous paintings in the world, Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. That group was represented. Those 2 people represented a larger group called Just Stop Oil, which released this statement demanding that the UK government halt all new oil and gas projects. So that was their activist motive. The same group glued themselves to another famous painting in the National Gallery in London, and then others glued themselves to a 1st century BC statue in the Vatican museums. We'll come back to that incident a little later in the discussion. My first question is, does this alarm you? What do you make of this specific type of art vandalism?
Well, my first reaction, Brandon, is rather sophomoric. I remember years and years, this is almost literally sophomoric because it was a conversation I had in college. I think I was a junior, though, at the time. One of my classmates, and he was filled with righteous indignation along these same lines and said, we should just tear down Chartres Cathedral and sell it if it fed, even 100 starving people. And why do we have the Sistine Chapel? We should just sell that and use the money to feed the hungry. Well, I get it, but I say it's sophomoric because it just is such a gross reductionism in regard to the transcendentals. If you look at the good, the true, and the beautiful, the good indeed is our commitment to be virtuous and to be morally upright. The good, that's one of the transcendental values. So of course, that matters immensely. The fact that we're sensitive to people who are hungry and thirsty and that we have to respond to their needs, yeah. But the other 2 transcendentals also should preoccupy our minds and spirits. The true, the search for truth, and the beautiful. So the arts represent this very high engagement with that 3rd transcendental of the beautiful. And you can't reduce any one to the other. You can't emphasize one at the complete expense of the other. Now, there might be in the course of your life a moment when you're going to privilege one or the other. Or maybe by predilection, you're going to be more attuned to the true or to the beautiful than the good or whatever. And that's fine. But what you can't do, seems to me, is to say we can dispense with the other two because one of them has become so central to our preoccupation. So sure, are there people who are suffering and is there great injustice in the world? Of course. But does that mean I can destroy beautiful things in order to address that problem? No. It's a sort of reduction of the transcendentals to one.
One thing that struck me was that rather than making rational arguments in support of their cause, something that you and I have championed for years on this podcast, instead they engage in what might be described as performative or transgressive art. They themselves are performing art and by destroying art. I just find that both ironic but interesting.
Yeah, it's, shock value, and as you say, kind of a transgressive move, to get people's attention. But the reductionism of it is just too dangerous. And I just think, Brandon, I go back to Malcolm Miller, the man who used to give tours at Chartres Cathedral. And maybe I've cited him before on this show, but he gave a talk I heard one time about reform in the church. And he said, sure, ecclesia semper reformanda. The church must always be reformed because the church is always falling off from its ideal. So, of course, there's a reforming spirit. So he said, I affirm that. But then he said, the best sign that a reformation process has gone wrong is when people start destroying beautiful things. And that always struck me as just dead right. Whenever this sort of iconoclasm breaks out, like let's start destroying beautiful things in the name of whatever, in the name of, honoring God's transcendence, or in the name of the poor, or in the name of, raising consciousness, something has gone wrong. And that transgressive move ought not to be applauded.
I like that insight. I think it's right. I was recently speaking about some of these stories with Father Steve Grunow, our CEO at Word on Fire, and he said something very profound right along the lines that you just quoted. Here's what Father Steve said. He said, there should be a warning signal that goes off whenever people start attacking beautiful things.
Yeah.
Whenever there's iconoclasm, there's anti-humanism. And whenever there's anti-humanism, there's anti-God. Is that how you see the trajectory?
Yeah, I wish Father Steve would write more because you're right. He always has great insights, and he and I talk all the time, and he has this kind of Lincoln-esque quality. He tends to speak that way, like in these lapidary phrases, and that's very well formulated. Because right, the beautiful is tied to the human. It's something that's distinctive to us, and the human is tied to God because it's God who gives us our dignity as human beings. And so when you start unraveling those connections, when you say, well, the beautiful doesn't matter, well, then right on the tail of that comes an anti-humanism. Well, then human beings don't really matter. And then if they don't really matter, well, then, God shouldn't be in the picture because we matter because of God. And so, yeah, I think that integrated view begins to unravel rapidly. And the way into that unraveling is to start wrecking beautiful things. I think, Brandon, go back to the early days of like John Damascene in the 7th and 8th centuries, the iconoclast controversy. That's when the church really engages us for the first time, when there were literally smashers of icons. That's what iconoclast means. Then the Reformation, 16th century, there was another iconoclastic outbreak, and it was terrible. You can see the effects of it still in Europe and some of the great churches. You see it in our country where there are many Protestant churches that are just kind of empty spaces. They didn't so much smash the icons, but they just sort of then ignored the iconic. But another one, to be frank, is in my own lifetime, after Vatican II. Not because of Vatican II, but after Vatican II in our country, there was a real iconoclastic outbreak. And ecclesia semper reformanda, but it's gone wrong when people start destroying beautiful things. So yeah, it's a very disturbing sign, you might say, within the culture. It's a disturbance in the force, as Obi-Wan Kenobi would say, right? But it's a disturbance in that integration that Father Steve was talking about.
Why does it seem that, along with Gnosticism, which is this heresy that's haunted us for the last 1900, 2000 years, iconoclasm seems to be another one of those dangers that just doesn't go away? It can't be defeated. It just lingers down, up and down the centuries.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and there's not an easy answer. But I think one angle, and I've read some psychologists talk about this. There's in the presence of the beautiful, there's awe and appreciation, right? When we're at our best. But at some level too, there can be a resentment of it. Like, well, I can't do that. Or who are these people that are spending all this money to make these things? And there's something about the beautiful that can raise the hackles in us. And we say, well, I don't know. I find that offensive and sort of reversion to the least common denominator. So maybe like even in the name of equality, if you're standing in the presence of Michelangelo's David, which I have, or the Pietà, who is this man that was able to do this? I mean, how do you even explain that? And might it stir up a resentment? Or who are these, aristocrats who have the money to afford this kind of thing? And, what about the common people? So there's that instinct toward egalitarianism or a certain anti-elitist instinct that I think can feed this animosity toward the arts sometimes.
Another thing that struck me about these stories of people destroying art with political motives is that I think everybody would agree, we should protect the environment, we should care about global justice and all those things. But the language they use elevates those concerns above everything else. I want to
Yeah.
read you a quote here from
Yeah.
one of the young women who glued herself to the sculpture of Laocoon and his sons at the Vatican Museums. Again, first century BC statue that is a priceless artifact. And this lady glues herself to it. Here's what she says. There will be no open museums, no art, no beauty in a world plagued by the climate and ecological emergency. Drought, floods, fires, pollution, scarcity of resources will take over if radical choices are not made in this regard. And I think what struck me was the apocalyptic, almost religious type of language used by these activists.
Yeah, and notice that that's a beautiful example of what we're talking about of the gross radical reductionism involved there. Because there are moral outrages, everything else has to cede. Well, when won't there be moral outrages? So let's say we solve the climate problem, or we solve world hunger, or whatever the problem is. Trust me, there'll be another set of problems coming along in the next generation. And so you say there'll be no art, there'll be no beauty, there'll be no cathedrals, no museums. Well, that means there will never be any of these things because there will always be these issues. Which then leads to your second point, really, about what I call the immanentizing of the eschatological. If ultimacy, we expect ultimacy to be achieved here, well, then we use rhetoric like that. It all comes down to our decisions to make things better in this world. But if you say, as the great religious traditions do, that our real eschatological fulfillment is not in this world, and in fact, this world will always be marked, as the Lord himself said, the poor you will always have with you, meaning there'll always be something flawed and imperfect about this world and our capacity to address its problems. And the eschaton that we hope for is not within this temporal framework. It's beyond space and time. It's a heavenly eschaton. So when you immanentize the eschatological, you'll get rhetoric like that. And she sounds to me very much like Puritans of most ages, even of a religious stripe. It has that sense of absolute rigor and ultimacy. My way or the highway, it must be this or everything will collapse. That sounds like end of the world apocalypticism, but now in a secular framework.
I want to get your feedback on another quote that one of the protesters said. This one I thought was very profound. This protester glued himself to a Constable painting in the National Gallery in London. And here's what he shouted to everyone watching. When billions of people are in pain and suffering, what use is art? How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, one thing is, look up and down the centuries, it's often the poor and the suffering who most appreciate the beautiful. Think of the poor who contributed massively to the building of the great medieval cathedrals. they wouldn't have happened without the sponsorship of kings and dukes and lords and all that. But they were largely built by very poor, ordinary people who were undoubtedly suffering immensely, and they felt a tremendous connection to these great works of art and wanted them. They knew they wouldn't have articulated it this way, but they knew in their bones the connection between the transcendentals, that the beautiful matters. Or I think of Reynold Hillenbrand, who, the rector of Mundelein Seminary in the 40s, leader in the liturgical movement, kind of a hero to me. And he said the poor need beauty as much as they need food and drink. And here's a guy who was, massively concerned about social justice, great friend of Dorothy Day and, all that. But at the same time, listen again to that. The poor need beauty as much as they need food and drink. And so don't drive wedges. Don't play this either or game with it. Now, let me add something, Brandon, because whenever this discussion comes up, I think of this. So yes, the three transcendentals, mutually implicative. We shouldn't play reductionistic games and one off the other. But I will say this, because these people, I want to give them the best spin. They are speaking out of a certain conviction that Dietrich von Hildebrand talks about. Namely, if you look at the three transcendentals, right, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Let's say a young person, for economic reasons or reasons of his family or whatever, is not able to achieve the truth the way he could have or should have. Never got a good education, never had access to books, never talked to smart people, and so his capacity for the true was truncated, right? Let's say that the same young person never achieved anything in the aesthetic realm, was never taught what makes something beautiful, never was brought to Gothic churches or to great paintings, and so the aesthetic side of his life was stymied, right? In those two cases, von Hildebrand said, we'd say, it's tragic, that's terrible, that's unfortunate, of course. But let's say this same person never achieved the good, never was morally upright, never loved his neighbor, never acted according to virtue and justice. We wouldn't just say, yeah, boy, that's really regrettable. We'd say that is abominable. That's horrific. That's something we would cry to heaven about. And his point, I think, is yes, the three transcendentals, yes, mutual implication, but there is a kind of primacy to the good. There's a kind of primacy to moral achievement and moral excellence. And that if you are forced to choose, you probably would choose the good as the road you should walk. So I'm gonna go a little bit down that road with some of these folks and give them as much credit as I can, that they are seized by this very strong sense of the moral imperative. We should be. And it does, if von Hildebrand is right, it does have a kind of primacy. Call it like a primus inter pares sort of primacy. It's maybe first among equals, belongs to the moral dimension.
Well, in the last few minutes here, I wanted to get your thoughts on art in general. So I wanted to zoom out of these particular scenarios and talk about the value of art in general. In G.K. Chesterton's classic book, The Everlasting Man, he makes this interesting observation in a pithy quote per his wont. He says, art is the signature of man. Art is the signature of man. He observes that the earliest human records that we have are cave paintings. 64,000 years ago, these caves in Spain, we see drawings of animals that the earliest cavemen, if you want to call them, made on the walls. So the first recorded human act is art. And Chesterton observes, we don't find that among any other living being. I'm going to quote him here. He says, we could dig very deep and find the place where a man had drawn the picture of a reindeer, but he would dig a good deal deeper before he found a place where a reindeer had drawn a picture of a man. It must seem at least odd that we could not find any trace of the beginning of any arts among the animals. That is the simplest lesson to learn in the cavern of the colored pictures. It is the simple truth that man does differ from the brutes in kind and not in degree. What do you make of that observation that art is the signature of man?
Yeah, it's right. And Chesterton there joins a group of philosophers and thinkers over the centuries who try to put their finger on what's distinctive to human beings. So Aristotle, we're the zoon logikon, we're the animal that has speech, or that got rendered in Latin as the rational animal, that we have capacity for rational thought. Karl Marx said the man is the productive animal. So you got all kinds of different definitions. But Chesterton, who was an artist himself, trained as an artist first, writes, of course, in a very artistic way. He's not a rationalistic writer. He's a much more artistic writer. What I would say is the capacity to appreciate the beautiful and to produce the truly beautiful is unique to human beings because it's tied to intellection. See, I'd bring Aristotle and Aquinas and Chesterton together because art is not like just making pretty pictures. It's, remember, as we've said, integritas, consonantia, claritas. It's wholeness, harmony, and radiance. And part of what you're producing when you make something really beautiful is that concordance of parts that make up an integrated whole. And that integrated whole then becomes radiant. There's the claritas. And the radiance is, as Jacques Maritain said, the radiance of form. It's the radiance of structured, harmonic intelligibility. Well, see, animals aren't capable of that. That's his point. But human beings, the rational animal, because we have this, we have a capacity to intuit essences or forms. That's why we can create something beautiful. Because the form, when it's appreciated intellectually, that's understanding intelligibility. But when the splendor of form is appreciated, that's the beautiful. So we can see it, and then we can produce it. If you're gifted enough, you can produce your own splendor formae, the splendor of form. So I would tie all that together, right? The man is the rational animal, and therefore he's the artistic animal.
Well, as we close, let me ask you one final question. What's special about a Christian understanding of art? How does the incarnation affect our relationship to art?
Well, that's just it, right? Because as Paul said, Christ is the icon of the invisible God. So he's the visible representation of the invisible God. The play between the visible and the invisible is very interesting in the arts because the visible, if it does attain this level of real aesthetic quality, it draws you through it toward the invisible source of all beauty, toward the pure form, if you want, who is God, the pure intelligibility, which is the divine intelligibility. So the incarnation is God making an icon of himself, so that through the visibility of Christ's humanity, we can see the invisibility of God. That is the ground of all properly Christian art, has that same basic inspiration. That even in the simplest work of art, I should be able to intuit something of the invisible beauty of God.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question, visit the website askbishopbarron.com, and there you can record your question on any device. Today we hear from John in Ohio, who's got a question about God's nature. Here's John's question.
My name is John from Ohio, and my question is, Bishop Barron, I've heard you many times say that God's true nature is love. But isn't it also truth? Could you discuss the interplay and relationship between love and truth? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. If you want God's, most fundamental Old Testament name, it's being. So, I am who I am, we hear in the Old Testament. Ipsum esse would be Aquinas' way of rendering that. God is the active to be itself. Well, that means that God is the fullness of reality. That means the fullness of truth and the fullness of goodness. Well, what's love? Love is to will the good of the other. And so God wills his own good. Now, what that means is not that God's missing something, but his will rests in the goodness that he is. His will enjoys the beauty and goodness that he is. And thus you see in God, therefore, truth and goodness come together. So that's why the divine love is certainly correlated to the divine truth. What God is loving is his own goodness, which is the same as his truth, if that makes sense. So all that really comes together in the divine manner of being.
Well, as we wrap up our discussion today, I want to remind you one more time to pick up your copy of Bishop Barron's newest book. Again, it's titled The Great Story of Israel. It is a theological and spiritual commentary on the first half of the Old Testament. So if you want to better understand the Old Testament, everything from Genesis all the way through 2nd Maccabees, this is the book you're going to want to pick up. I'll make sure we link to it in the show notes so you can pick up your copy today. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching.
Peace be with you, and Happy New Year's Day. We come today to the beginning of the liturgical year, the first Sunday of Advent. What is it about Advent? I've always loved it. To me, it's a very spiritually powerful season, and it might be because there's sort of a permanent Advent quality to the Christian life. Adventus, the coming of the Lord. He came in time, that's true, and he's coming into our hearts now, but also we're longing for his coming at the end of time. That means all of Christian history, now over 2,000 years, is going to go on. Who knows how much longer? There's always a vigil quality to it. We're waiting. We're watching. There's something unfulfilled about this life. We want something we don't fully have. And I think the Advent season calls all this to mind, brings all this to consciousness. And these readings for the first Sunday of Advent, they are so powerful, helping us to get ourselves focused spiritually. The image now from reading number 1, taken from the prophet Isaiah. Can I recommend everybody, take out your Bibles, Isaiah chapter 2, and you find this beautiful image which has given rise to so much reflection and so much artistic expression and spiritual articulation over the centuries. It has to do with the mountain. Listen. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest mountain. Isaiah was from Jerusalem, from Judea. He knew very well that city on the top of Mount Zion, but more importantly, the city where the temple of the Lord was situated, the place where Israel gave God right praise, the place that was seen as practically, literally, the dwelling place of God on earth. In days to come, that means at the culmination of all things. This will be the highest mountain. Now, Isaiah knew perfectly well this is not true in a literal sense, that Zion was clearly the highest mountain of the world, but he means it here spiritually. At the fulfillment of all time, here's his point. The praise of God will be the supreme value. It will be raised above all the other mountains that might compete with it. So here's our first Advent challenge as we're preparing for the coming of the Lord. What's of highest value to you? What's the highest mountain? Now, everyone's got it. We might pretend otherwise in our kind of secularized age, but it's just not true. For every person, there's some mountain that's highest. There's some place where you are offering worship. Oh, it might be your country. It might be your culture. It might be your family. It might be, a pop star. Who knows? Something or somebody is of highest value, and you spend your time ordering your life to that good. Now, mind you, everything I mentioned, they're all good. Nothing really wrong with them in themselves, countries and cultures and even pop stars. But they're not meant to be worshiped. They're not meant to be the highest mountain. In the days to come, that's what we're waiting for with the Adventus of the Lord. The praise of God will be the highest mountain. So there's our challenge for Advent, everybody. And maybe can I suggest to you for these 4 weeks before Christmas, keep that image of Isaiah's mountain in your mind. Where do you worship? What's of highest value to you? I mentioned before, Christ wants to be the Lord of your life. Not a minor figure in your life. Not a peripheral figure, not one inspiring person among many. He wants to be the Dominus, the Lord of your life. Is praise of him the highest mountain? What's competing with him? Good question to ask in these weeks of Advent. Now, listen as Isaiah goes on. All nations shall stream toward it. Many people shall come and say, come, let us climb the Lord's mountain to the house of the God of Jacob. Now, this is an image. Isaiah would have known this directly and personally. The tribes of Israel coming up to Mount Zion for the various feasts of the Jewish year. So the Jews from all over Israel, but also from even around the wider world, would come to Jerusalem to offer praise. Read some of the Psalms, and they're literally Psalms about going up to Zion. They probably were songs that accompanied the people as they made their way up Mount Zion. In days to come, that means at the culmination of all things, he envisions not just the people of Israel, but all the nations of the world coming together in the common praise of God. Beautiful, beautiful image. But let me suggest, read it in kind of a personal and spiritual way. When God is worshiped, when Mount Zion is the highest mountain, what happens? All the tribes within you stream together to that point. So I'm using this external reality as a symbol of an internal reality. Think of all the tribes going up now as your mind, your will, your private life, your public life, your friendships, your passions, your energies, all the things that make up your life. All of them now streaming together toward the one point of right praise. You see, when we give glory to God in the highest, then a sort of harmony begins to obtain within our own souls. Do you ever wonder now, fellow sinners, because we all fall into this, all of us sinners, why do we feel so much tension within ourselves? Why is there so much interior conflict? Because I haven't found the place of right praise. As long as I'm worshiping something other than the true God, then all the forces within me are going to be cacophonous, at odds with each other. They won't go streaming together to the one place. Now, listen with this point in mind as Isaiah goes on. He shall judge between the nations and impose terms on many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. One nation shall not raise the sword against another. I've spoken to you before about nonviolence, how Jesus picks up this theme so powerfully in the Sermon on the Mount. Yes, indeed, this is about at the culmination of the age, when all the peoples of the world come together in the praise of the true God, it'll be an end to war. Because conflicts among the nations come ultimately from forms of bad praise. You know, if your country, your culture, your project, your prerogatives are of highest value, and then someone else is also worshiping on a false mountain, we will come into conflict. So at the culmination of the age, there'll be peace among the nations of the world. That's what Isaiah envisions. But can I stay with our metaphor? Think of those powers within you. Mind, will, energies, passions, friendships, all that. What happens in us when God is not being given the highest praise? They fight with each other, right? Fellow sinners, am I right? What do we experience on the inside? That our minds are at odds with our wills, right? I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't do it. Paul says that in Romans 7, the good that I would do, it's that I do not do. The evil that I would avoid, it's that I do. See, that's a riven, divided person speaking. That happens when God is not being given highest praise. Or my will says this, but my passions say that. My private life is lived this way, my public life is lived another way. My one friendship leads me down this path, another friendship leads me down another path. I'm at war with myself. But see, in the days to come, when God is given highest praise, then the swords that are battling within me will be turned into plowshares, and the spears, all the fighting within me, they'll be turned into pruning hooks, into the tools of cultivation. Concentrate, everybody, during this Advent, giving God highest praise, making Mount Zion the true pole of your life. And you'll find peace breaking out more and more within you. Okay, when should all this happen? When should we get with this program? Listen now to Paul in our second reading. He's speaking to the little Christian community gathered in Rome. You know, I was in Rome not that long ago, and I always think of this when I go there. Now, I mean, Rome, the center of Roman Catholicism and this great institutional, place. But back in those days, I mean, the Christian community was a little tiny group gathered probably in the Jewish quarter of Rome. So Paul writes to them, you know the time, it's the hour now for you to awake from sleep. That's a great biblical theme, by the way, Old Testament and New, sleep. Sleep is not good spiritually. Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will give you life. Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, but his disciples can't stay awake. They fall asleep. Sleep is symbolic in the Bible of lack of spiritual attention. It's a kind of laziness, acedia, sloth. Karl Barth said that. The sin of our time is not pride. It's sloth. And I think he's been proven right in our time with all this falling away from the faith, all this indifference to things of religion. The problem is that we've got a culture that's fallen asleep religiously, indifferent to this question of who or what is getting right praise, content somehow with the riven, divided self. Paul says, you know the time. The hour is now for you to awake from sleep. So everybody, Advent is a time of attention. Wake up. He's coming. Keep vigil, keep watch. Don't fall asleep. Don't succumb to this bland indifferentism of our culture. No, now. Wake up. Get your life ordered. Make sure you know what the highest mountain in your life is. And then just to finish this, look in the gospel. Jesus says, therefore, stay awake. You do not know on which day your Lord will come. That's true, in the sense of our own death. We don't know when that will be. So wake up. Wake up. Now is the time. Yeah, my life has been kind of out of order for a long time, and I know I'm at war with myself, and I know I worship on the wrong mountain. I know, so wake up. Stop making excuses. Now is the time. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, we come to the third Sunday of Advent, and it always strikes me as we move through Advent what an Isaiah season it is. We hear week after week from the prophet Isaiah during Advent. We heard a couple weeks ago about the holy mountain to which all the tribes go up. We heard last week about the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. And today the great image from Isaiah is that of the blooming desert. Listen, the desert and the parched land will exult. The steppe will rejoice and bloom. They will bloom with abundant flowers and rejoice with joyful song. Now, keep in mind, the biblical authors were desert people. They were well acquainted with the desert. And I've got a little acquaintance with it in the course of my life, including living in California, where I was in Santa Barbara. It's called the coastal desert. So very dry climate. And anyone that lives in deserts knows that parched land, and then when the rains come, suddenly, overnight, the desert blooms. And it's extraordinary. You think that this land will never will never bloom with life. And then just from this one rain, the whole hillside, the whole desert suddenly flowers. Well, that's the image Isaiah has in mind. And I want to stay with that juxtaposition of death and life here, because very often in the Bible, the great heroes have to spend time in the desert. Think of it in story after story. Abraham has to cross the desert to get to the promised land. Joseph is sent into Egypt and into prison before he's ready for his mission. Think of Moses, his many years as a shepherd in the desert before he becomes a liberator. Think of John the Baptist, a voice crying in the deserted places. Think of Paul, who goes into the desert of Arabia for a long time after seeing the risen Lord, as he tries to understand what happened to him. Jesus himself, famously spending 40 days and nights in the desert. Well, what is it about deserts? A place where we get back to basics, a place where extraneous things are stripped away. In many cases, the place where they come into contact with their own sinfulness, where they learn radical dependence upon God. I mean, whatever it is, the desert means all those things for the great heroes. But watch how they bloom, these characters. Abraham, after crossing the desert, becomes the father of great nations. Moses, after his time in the desert, becomes the great liberator of his people. John the Baptist, spending time in the desert, announces the arrival of the Messiah. Paul, after spending time in Arabia, emerges as the great apostle to the Gentiles. Indeed, the desert in all these cases bloomed with life. Now, let's apply it to our situation. Many, many people I know go through desert times. And maybe someone listening to me right now is going through that kind of period. Remember a lady many, many years ago when I was doing pastoral ministry, passing through a terrible time of depression. You know, she once had lots of life and energy, and then suddenly it was gone. Anyone involved in pastoral ministry often comes across people who are passing through these very bleak and dry periods. You know, it's harrowing in its own way, but it's one of the best books about depression is by the novelist William Styron, the man that wrote Sophie's Choice. He struggled personally with depression. The book is called Darkness Visible. And if you have the courage, find it and read it. It's one of the most kind of brutally honest treatments of what it's like to go through depression. Well, the woman I referred to, I remember when I was ministering to her, I asked her to read some of the great desert texts in the Bible. So these various stories that I've been referring to read about Joseph and about Moses and about Abraham and about John the Baptist. All those that spent, many years in some cases passing through the desert before, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, they bloomed. Well, I offer this not as some kind of, facile resolution, but in the case of that lady I'm referring to, she did come through her depression, and she bloomed in the most marvelous way because she became a counselor, studied psychology, became a counselor, and focused on people who, like herself, were passing through times of depression. She became a source of life for many who were in that same situation that she was. The desert indeed bloomed. Think of your own experience now. Maybe you are passing through the desert. How long will it go on? I don't know. In the Bible, as I say, sometimes it's years long. Think again of Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt and then becoming a prisoner of Pharaoh. Think of Moses. Many years after his time as prince of Egypt, he has to go through many years of training and trial in the desert before his time. That's up to the Holy Spirit. And see, it's like when you're living in a desert climate. When will this desert bloom? As day after day of heat and humidity and day after day of aridity, and you say, when will this happen? And then like a great grace, the rain comes and the desert blooms. The Bible, I think, loves that juxtaposition. The Bible loves this dynamic of the desert now coming to life. Well, now, with that in mind, that's Isaiah. But then look at our second reading, which I love. It's from the letter of James. By the way, take out your Bibles, everybody, when you have a chance, and read the letter of James. It's very short. You can read the whole letter in one sitting. But it packs a punch. There's so much spiritual and moral richness in it. And this image now for today, it's a classic Advent image. And it's like Isaiah's. It's an agricultural image. Listen. James says, be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. Advent, it's the season of patient waiting. But listen now. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. So we're not so much here the desert blooming, but it's a slightly revised agricultural image. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. Think of a farmer now, and I'm recording these words, I'm in Minnesota now, and I'm just surrounded by farms. My diocese is just a little bit north of Iowa, so it's very much farm country. Think of the farmers who plant seeds. You look at a seed, there's just not much to it. It wouldn't nourish you. It's not very attractive. It's just this little tiny thing, and it goes into the ground. And the farmer waits. Let's face it, a lot of that's out of his control. Once the seed is sown, and now it depends upon the weather that he can't really control. It depends upon time and this mysterious alchemy of soil and moisture and so on that causes the seed to grow. Be patient. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. Again, be patient with it, he says. What's the worst thing you can do if you're a farmer? Come on, why aren't you growing? I better dig around and make that thing grow faster. I'll get in there and I'll fuss around with it. No. Leave it alone. The person in the desert can't force the blooming. He waits for the rains to come. So the farmer waits patiently. And then, listen, until it receives the early and late rains. Now, that's the translation here. Other translations have the winter and spring rains. Farmer can't control that. When these rains come, he waits for them. And there's something about that image, for me anyway, of the winter rain. I don't know about you, but I think that's the worst kind of weather, period. Think of, heat and cold and snow and so on. I mean, even like a snowstorm. Something lovely about walking through a snowstorm. Something aesthetically pleasing about it. Even nice to be out in a snowstorm. But the weather that I think is just the most disagreeable is cold rain. Think of it like a late November rain, winter rains. Well, the farmer waits and he endures these rather unpleasant conditions until the seed grows and becomes something beautiful and life-giving. Okay, how do we read our lives? I'm going through depression. Things aren't working out. I'm just full of anxiety all the time, and I'm failing at this and failing at that, and it's not what I want. So there's no meaning. God has abandoned me. No one cares about me. My life is a disaster. No, that's not the way to read it. Read it as a time of patient waiting. Maybe the Lord has drawn you into the desert. Maybe it is to awaken a deeper sense of dependence upon Him. Maybe it is to purge away something that needs purging away in you. My life it's like winter rain. Yeah, I know. I mean, I've gone through those periods. Again, maybe some listening right now are going through a time where it's winter rain. Just unpleasant. Okay, dumb suffering or the winter rains necessary for the growth of the seed. The farmer waits patiently and endures even this very unpleasant weather. So everybody, we're in this season of waiting, the season of Advent. And I said a couple weeks ago that there's a permanent Advent quality to Christian life, right? Because, all of us, let's face it, we're not going to find our ultimate satisfaction in this life. We won't. This life will always, to some degree, be a desert experience. To some degree, this life will always be like the seed that's in the ground and we're waiting. Be patient. Know that God has not abandoned us. In fact, God is the great and ultimate cultivator. What's Christmas? Christmas is the sign of this. Christmas is the blooming of the desert. Christmas is that seed finally yielding its fruit. So don't give up. Don't lose heart. Rather, be patient as we wait